Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at this event. I would particularly like to extend a warm welcome to the Honourable Madam Justice Roxane George, Chief Justice of Guyana, His Excellency Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, former Governor General of Jamaica and former Principal and Pro Vice Chancellor of the UWI Mona campus, Professor Bridget Brereton, Professor Emerita of History at the UWI St. Augustine campus, Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves, Managing Director, Historical Research International, Inc., and the author of the book being launched today. I also wish to recognize persons who are attending from the University of the West Indies in general, the University of Guyana, University of Oxford, University of Aberystwyth, the UK National Archives, and Honorary Society of the Inner Temple. We also would like to welcome members of the legal profession who have joined us today for this book launch, members of the Collins-Gonsalves and all subfamilies, and persons who are attending from across the Caribbean and from countries such as the UK, the USA, Canada, and Australia. Ladies and gentlemen, all, welcome. My name is Judith Toppin, and I'm honored to have been asked to serve as moderator for today's book launch, which chronicles the life of a legal luminary, Iris de Freitas Brazao. It is pleasing to note that so many persons have come together and opted to spend time today to celebrate this very special occasion with the author, Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves. Women's History Month is celebrated during March. However, we have taken the liberty to acknowledge the significant contribution of an accomplished and brilliant lawyer in the English Caribbean in the month of April. I am sure that you will be inspired and gain valuable and informative insight into the life of Iris de Freitas Brazao. It is both ironic and notable that one of the positive outcomes of the COVID-19 pandemic has been the introduction of software and technology, which facilitates the seamless gathering of persons from various parts of the world within a virtual space. This book launch is totally online. And while I'm sure that we're all thankful that the pandemic is under control, we are indeed grateful and sometimes even amazed at the technological advancements which have emerged, flourished, and effectively added another dimension to our lives. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. The Honourable Madam Justice Roxane George holds the prestigious position of Chief Justice of Guyana. She has served as Director of Public Prosecutions, acting and present judge, and is substantially as a Justice of Appeal in Guyana. Like Iris de Freitas Brazao, Justice George has the distinction of being a graduate of the University of Oxford, where she graduated with a master's degree in international human rights law. With distinction, she is also a distinguished graduate of the Hugh Wooding Law School, where she was adjudged the most outstanding student and the best graduating Guyanese student. Justice George comes from a great legal tradition, for her father, Justice Kenneth George, served as Chancellor of the Judiciary of Guyana. Justice George has served as President of the Guyana Association of Women Lawyers, and she's a member of the Guyana Association of Women Judges, the Caribbean Association of Judicial Officers, the Caribbean Association of Women Judges, the Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association, and the International Association of Women Judges. Within the English-speaking Caribbean, Justice George has served as a facilitator for seminars for the training of magistrates on gender-based violence and on human rights. The Honourable Madam Justice George was conferred with Guyana's National Award of Cacique Crown of Honour. It's now my pleasure to invite Madam Justice Roxane George to make her presentation.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. This is Judith Toppin, and thank you for your kind words of introduction. Your Excellency, the Most Honourable Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, former Governor General of Jamaica, Professor Bridget Brereton, Professor Emerita University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves, Managing Director, Historical Research International Incorporated, distinguished guests and attendees. A pleasant Sunday afternoon to you all. Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves, I extend heartiest congratulations to you on the publication of your book entitled Iris de Freitas Brazao, Legal Luminary and Trailblazer, Caribbean, Canada, Wales, and England, 1896 to 1989. I also congratulate you on the award of third place in the nonfiction category of the Guyana Prize for Literature 2024. I express appreciation for your invitation to provide the foreword to the book, which celebrates the life of Iris de Freitas Brazao, and for your invitation to participate at this book launch. I know that the book was not written with the hope of an award in mind, but I am elated that your very laudable work has been deservedly recognized. This afternoon, I offer these brief remarks, not only as Chief Justice Acting of Guyana, but as a proud member of the Guyana Association of Women Lawyers, the GAWL, whose members stand on the shoulders of women lawyers like Ms. Brazao, who I refer to in the foreword as a hidden gem of the legal profession of Guyana. This captivating and informative book not only chronicles the life of this inspirational woman lawyer, but is rich in its historical content, providing insights into Ms. Brazao's Portuguese history and ancestry, her family, and the societies in which she lived. It briefly recounts the formation and some of the work of the GAWL, and in so doing, provides a link between the achievements of Ms. Brazao as the first woman lawyer admitted to practice in Guyana in 1929, and the formation of the association in 1987 by the equally pioneering and trailblazing founder-president of GAWL, the Honourable Justice Desiree Bernard, retired judge of the Caribbean Court of Justice, now of blessed memory. It was an honor for me to recount from the book, albeit briefly, the story of this remarkable woman at a recent brunch hosted by the GAWL in celebration of International Women's Day 2024 under the theme, Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress so as to inspire inclusion. Relying on this theme, my remarks highlighted the pioneering efforts of Ms. Brazao to the guests, who included women lawyers, many of whom are relatively young in the profession. The book details Ms. Brazao's journey to becoming the first Caribbean-born woman to be called to the English bar in January 1929, and the first woman to be called to the bar in the Caribbean on the 29th of August, 1929, in Barbados, where she was born. There she was hailed by Acting Chief Justice Jackman as the first Portia of the Caribbean, referencing the legal scholar Portia in Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. She was later called to the bar in then British Guyana on the 18th of September 1929, before Chief Justice de Freitas. She commenced her practice in Guyana after her call, working as defense counsel, and then became Crown Counsel with the distinction of being the first woman prosecutor. She also served in the Office of the Attorney General and later as legal advisor to the governor. She served in other public service capacities, for example, as a member of the Public Service Commission, and gave voluntary service to the community, for example, through the Red Cross Society and the Public Library. In her first case before Justice Savory in November 1929, while wishing her success, His Honor acknowledged as being historic her presence as the first lady barrister appearing in court. Her achievements were so historic that her exploits were recounted in several Commonwealth newspapers. In 1934, it was reported in a Canadian newspaper, the Coleman Journal, in an article headed, "Woman Crown Attorney, Lady Lawyer Holds Responsible Position in British Guyana," that Ms. de Freitas absolutely refutes the conscientious bachelor's suggestion that a woman's place is still in the home. The article highlighted that she's quite at home in the courts. Following her marriage to barrister at law Alfred Brazao in 1937, she faced tremendous pressure to relinquish her job and use her husband's surname. The issue of her continuing to hold public office as a married woman led to a debate in the all-male legislature in 1940. The Attorney General fortunately defended her right to work and her right to retain her maiden name professionally. Indeed, it is recounted that Ms. Brazao adopted the position that she would retain her maiden name after marriage, following the precedent set by Miss Helena Normanton in England, who in 1924 was the first married woman to be granted a passport in her maiden name. Despite the privilege of her tertiary education and historical status, being a woman and a person of mixed race, Ms. Brazao faced many challenges on both counts, but by dint of her resilience and commitment to excellence, she prevailed. As such, Dr. Collins-Gonsalves commented that Ms. Brazao's journey is a key record of the history of aspects of the struggle of women and for the rights of women in Guyana. As I read about this aspect of Ms. Brazao's journey, it occurred to me that the more things change, the more they remain the same. For still in 2024, we are debating a woman's right to choose her name, and we still have to strenuously advocate to ensure women's rights and gender equality. Ms. Brazao's is a story of academic achievement and scholarship, but it also highlights the importance of leadership and inclusion. She was fortunate in that despite being a person of color who was born out of wedlock, her father ensured that she was well educated. Her professor in English law at the University College of Wales noted in 1923 that she proved to be one of the best law students they had ever had at the college. Ms. Brazao is quoted as saying, "The world can take your material possessions, even your life, but never your education. It is with you endlessly." It is in this vein that I lauded the GAWL for continuing the association's trademark law and due publications that are now being translated into Spanish and French, with efforts to have translations into languages of our indigenous people. I also commended the association for continuing the outreaches to the women's prison and communities countrywide, continuing the book award to the best graduating law students, and maintaining the scholarship fund in memory of the late GAWL founder member, Ms. Deborah Bakker. I further encourage members of GAWL to pursue continuing education so as to equip themselves to be on the cutting edge in the provision of legal and other services that are so necessary in accelerating progress given Guyana's fast-growing and evolving economy and society. The book demonstrates how she overcame discrimination and thereby emphasizes that we must remain committed to advocacy against discrimination while promoting inclusion. Importantly, in continuing her legacy, we must strive to be pioneers and trailblazers, more especially in the cause of ensuring equality for women. There is so much that still requires attention as we continue to advocate for women's rights and, by extension, the advancement of human rights of all. We must strive to ensure that the legacies of leadership and service and the commitment to scholarship and excellence espoused by Ms. Brazao and the many women lawyers who have followed in her footsteps remain an inspiration for all our endeavors. Their trailblazing legacies have allowed women to be the majority of law students graduating from the University of Guyana, the majority graduating from the law schools, and the majority in the administration of justice in Guyana. In 1985, Ms. Brazao noted that she never regretted becoming a lawyer, as it is a profession which lends an incisive and clear approach to issues. I echo her sentiments in that we need to be incisive and clear in our approaches to the many issues confronting our societies. Ms. Brazao is also celebrated in the Caribbean Court of Justice Academy for Law 2021 publication entitled Pioneering Caribbean Women Jurists. And on her passing in 1989, the late Llewellyn Jones Senior Counsel stated that she was a fitting example for all to emulate. Therefore, emulating Ms. Brazao, we must be in the forefront of championing what is right, what is ethical, and what is just. We must lead in order to accelerate the progress we would like to see, and thereby inspire inclusion. Inspire the inclusion that allowed Ms. Brazao to leave an indelible mark on the history of Guyana. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Madam Justice Roxane George, for that very insightful and informative presentation on Iris de Freitas Brazao. As you mentioned, she is indeed a hidden gem, but we hope that in the not too distant future, she will be much better known among not only law students, but the general population of women and men who may be interested in some of the trailblazing persons who have made a contribution to the development of the region. I think it's important to note too her influence on women's rights, on gender and equality. And I think that the fact that there is a Guyana Association of Women Lawyers and the work that they're doing is pivotal to us getting a good understanding of the way we need to move and how we need to move in terms of ensuring that we can fulfill some of the legacy that may have been left by Iris de Freitas Brazao. I now move on to the next presenter, His Excellency, the Most Honourable Professor Sir Kenneth Hall. And I be pleased to introduce Sir Kenneth Hall. His Excellency, the Most Honourable Professor Sir Kenneth Hall has served as the former Governor General of Jamaica, the former Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal of the University of the West Indies, and former Deputy Secretary General of the Caribbean Community, the CARICOM Secretariat. He holds both a PhD and an MA, Masters in History from Queen's University of Ontario, Canada. Professor Hall has served as the Vice President of Academic Affairs and the Faculty Dean at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. He has been Professor of American Studies at SUNY Old Westbury from 1973 to 1994, Assistant Provost for Academic Programs at SUNY Albany, and Assistant Provost at SUNY Oswego. He has also been the Professor of History, a Faculty Research Associate at Syracuse University, among other posts. Professor Sir Hall is renowned for his contribution to the advancement of the regional integration process and has published extensively in this area, including books titled Integrator Parish, Perspectives of Leaders of the Integration Movement and Caribbean Integration from Crisis to Transformation and Repositioning, among many others. He is the first Chancellor of the University of the Commonwealth Caribbean, formerly known as University College of the Caribbean. Professor Hall is the recipient of the Order of Jamaica and the Order of the Nation. So Hall was conferred with the Knight of the Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George by Queen Elizabeth II, and the Grand Cross of the Order of Civil Merit of Spain. Professor Sir Hall is a Professor Emeritus of the University of the West Indies, Mona, Honorary Distinguished Fellow of the Mona School of Business and Management, the patron of the Institute for Question, sorry if I mispronounced that, Institute of Public Affairs, and patron of the P.J. Patterson Institute of Africa Caribbean Advocacy. He continues his academic writing and publishing, and publishes pertinent works on Caribbean regional integration. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to introduce and to ask Professor Sir Hall to address us.
Madam Chairperson, and permit me on a point of personal privilege to acknowledge my classmate, Professor Bridget Brereton, who, as I indicated earlier, was by far the most distinguished member of our history class in the 1960s. Chief Justice, Honorable Chief Justice of Guyana, and other members of the judiciary. I suspect some of them will be listening. And of course, the author whose work we are, in a sense, celebrating. It is a privilege and a pleasure to be here this afternoon. The work Iris de Freitas Brazao, Legal Luminary and Trailblazer, is in fact a trailblazing book in itself. It documents the work of not only a distinguished lawyer, distinguished person, but perhaps most importantly, a distinguished female, particularly given the conditions under which in which she worked. I am intrigued myself by the work that has been done by not only by this book. I have had a long association with Dr. Gonsalves, and I'm therefore perhaps a little more familiar with her writings, which some of you know, on her work on the Portuguese in the Caribbean. But she has also worked and documented not only this in this book, but earlier, as I was signaling to some of the panelists, works such as Lloyd Best, the collection of Lloyd Best, this distinguished academic in the Caribbean. And she spent months documenting it and putting together 3 volumes of his papers, some of which are still not published. But it is an indication that she had promised over 20 years ago she was doing that. So I am very, very pleased and wish to congratulate you that you have developed those skills in the production of this book. I value the book as a historian from a variety of perspectives, not the least of which are the copious footnotes and the context in which the subject was placed. Because as we delve into the book, we are exposed to the history, culture, race relations, gender relations, and all the issues of the time. We should also, of course, recall that this was a period of British colonialism in these parts. And what is amazing from my perspective was, how did this person navigate the empire, as it were, to get an education and then to contribute. It is a remarkable document. It's a remarkable person to have done that. You may not have dealt with it as much, but one of the questions I have, Dr. Collins-Gonsalves, is how prevalent or how often was a person born out of wedlock in that period of the early 20th century, and yet was able to navigate all of this with this support. And what is so important here is that she got the support of her father and brother. That in itself struck me as being unusual, to fund her to have an education as a female and to do so in the places that she went. I thought that was something which you might consider looking at when you do the next volume. How, the significance of this in itself. But this key element of this is that here was a person born in the colonial Caribbean. And this is also important to emphasize, that this is about a Caribbean female. Because growing up in Barbados, living in Guyana, but importantly going to Canada, Wales, and England at the time she did, coming from, again, the colonies, I am impressed with her resilience, her determination, and all of what it took to navigate that space at the time. As a graduate of Queen's, and I thank you for reminding us in this book that I noticed you noted it and you documented it, that these institutions were not exactly friendly to people of color, and particularly people of color from outside, well, from the Caribbean, let me be more specific, because it's not until the 1980s that prohibition on being admitted to medicine at Queen's University was removed. And Toronto, I'm sure, had similar discouraging features, if not outright prohibition. And so for anyone studying in that time, as a student myself in the 60s, it was not as overt, but the atmosphere was still there. You just didn't, you were considered, the discrimination in the community was quite evident. And in the universities at the time, it was improving, but the legacy could still be found in all of the works you did. If you did good work, it was expressed as a surprise. You were queried about where did you get this kind of information and this knowledge, so that the legacy and the expectations of someone coming from the Caribbean, achieving what she did in law, studying in different institutions and multiple institutions, multiple disciplines at the same time, and being successful is to be commended. But I want to focus really on just two aspects of the book: the work by the author herself and the substance of the work. The author, let me commend her. As I said, she pursued this subject with meticulous research, the footnotes, creating and setting the environment was for me a tremendous piece of work, of historical work. And then documenting the contributions of the legal luminary in the landscape, as we said, across continents, across time, and ultimately influencing, that is her subject, Iris, influencing the way the society in Guyana and across the Caribbean evolved during the transition from colonialism to independence. My suggestion then is that this is not simply a biography. It is a scholarly biography, but it is a testament to the author of the power of storytelling to preserve and honor the legacy of trailblazers. When I did African history, as I'm an African history by training, it always occurred to me that there was a tradition, certainly in places like Oxford and Cambridge, that Africa had no history. And the reason they came to this rather awkward conclusion was that it was not written anywhere. And I think what you have done in this case, although Iris did not leave a written biography, or as I understand it, she did not write or did not have access to her papers, the meticulous work in being able to put together from public records, from libraries and elsewhere, is itself to be commended, because you are now able to present someone who would not, or who would otherwise be lost to history because she did not write her own story. The book is also a testament of the need for us to write our stories, in a sense. And in this case, it's fortunate that it is a female writing about another female. And I am pleased about that. Having myself been influenced by two brilliant Guyanese females in my own development, I can testify that there's something about Guyanese scholars and Guyanese women in particular, which I certainly I admire, and it is documented in this, because this clearly demonstrates a tradition of excellence, which is in some respects unparalleled in the Caribbean. I want, therefore, to celebrate not only the book, but as I said, the work which you have done, Dr. Collins-Gonsalves, because it also reflects the lessons that this trailblazer imparted. The lessons of resilience, the legacy of resilience, the commitment to justice, which her whole character and career demonstrated, and perhaps more importantly, her pioneering spirit. She was not deterred by the obstacles in her way. She simply pursued excellence, inclusion, and justice. So on behalf of myself, certainly, and I hope I speak for all the listeners and those who are participating, I'd like really to extend very hearty congratulations and gratitude to you, Dr. Gonsalves, for this invaluable contribution to scholarship and ensuring that the legacy of Iris de Freitas continues for the indefinite future and laying down a marker as a pioneer and as a trailblazer for future generations. Thank you very much.
Very much, Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, for those very enlightening words. I think I can just very quickly say that one of the biggest takeaways is that we must write our own story. I think that that is what I've taken away from your presentation, that we have to make a concerted effort to write our own story. If not, it will be lost to the future generations to come. I now move on to introduce Professor Emerita Bridget Brereton. Professor Bridget Brereton is a Professor Emerita of History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad and Tobago. A distinguished historian, she specializes in Caribbean social history, the history of Trinidad and Tobago, Caribbean historiography, and women and gender in the Caribbean. She has published several groundbreaking works of history, including a history of modern Trinidad, 1783 to 1962, race relations in colonial Trinidad, 1870 to 1900, law, justice, and empire, the colonial career of Chief Justice John Gorey, and from Imperial College to University of the West Indies, a history of the St. Augustine campus, among others. She's also edited volume 5 of the prestigious UNESCO General History of the Caribbean in the 20th Century. Professor Bridget Brereton is the first woman to win the prestigious Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence for Research, Teaching, and Administration, and this was awarded in 1996. And she has served as the president of the Association of Caribbean Historians from 1994 to 1997, among many other key and noted positions. Please welcome Professor Emerita Bridget Brereton to make her presentation.
Madam Chairperson, and good afternoon to my distinguished fellow panelists, all protocols observed, as we say in Trinidad. And good afternoon also to all the guests who are listening and participating in this launch. I do feel honored to be part of this very impressive panel. And I want to thank Joanne for inviting me first to write a very brief introduction to the book that we're launching, and secondly, to speak briefly this afternoon. Now, ever since 1970 or thereabouts, historians and other people too have been trying to ensure that women are featured in history as it's researched and written. We all know it's a bad pun, but we cannot resist it. We need her story as well as history. It's a bad pun because history is not a word that comes from his story. It comes from a completely different Greek root, but nobody can resist the her story, his story pun. So this effort that has been going on now for over 50 years has given rise to women's history and gender history as a distinct branch or subfield of the discipline of history. From the very beginning, an important part in this project of inserting women into history was to research the lives of women who broke glass ceilings of one kind or another. Outstanding women, pioneering women, the first women who were the first to achieve something, to join a profession, to enter a legislative body, whatever. Women who pioneered. Now at UWI St. Augustine, we have taught a course on women and gender in Caribbean history for decades. But to my shame, I will admit, Until recently, I had never heard of Iris de Freitas. I first got to know of her when I became involved in a project of the Caribbean Court of Justice's Academy of Law. The Chief Justice referred to it. This was a project to research, celebrate, and write a book about pioneering women jurists. I will just hold up the book. It is a very large book in a very elegant pink, which features essays on 34 pioneering women jurists. And Iris de Freitas was one of them. There is a short essay in the book by Crystal Sucre, a young TNT lawyer, about Iris. And that is where I first met Iris de Freitas. That essay definitely attracted my attention. I thought it was a remarkable story. It was very briefly told in that essay. So I was quite delighted when I heard that Joanne was researching and would publish a full-length biography. Like Sir Kenneth, I knew Joanne long before she started work on Iris. I first knew her when she was a PhD student at St. Augustine. And while she was there, she certainly won a reputation for being a very industrious researcher, having a very strong work ethic, and having strong analytical as well as research skills. So I was delighted that she was working on the book, and not at all surprised that the book came to fruition in a short space of time. And to my surprise, I will admit, she created a company and published it herself. By the way, I have no doubt that this book could have been published by any academic press. I feel sure of that, but she chose to be an entrepreneur as well as everything else, and she has created her own company. It really is a tribute. I agree completely with both the previous speakers. It is a tribute to Joanne's dogged and patient research, her stamina, her skills in seeking sources, that she was able to tell so much about Iris de Freitas. Because, as Sir Kenneth mentioned, and as Joanne says, unfortunately, Iris did not write anything about her own life. She did not leave any autobiographical writings, any diaries, any journals. If she had, Joanne's life would have been so much easier, but she did not. And so Joanne had to search for archival and other sources very widely, in Guyana, of course, in Britain for sure, in Canada, and in other places. It was not easy. Fortunately, there was a family link in that Iris's mother knew, Joanne's mother knew Iris well. So there was a family link which she could make use of, but it was really a feat of looking for scattered sources and putting together as much as she could of her life. Now, you've already heard that Iris was born in Barbados in 1896. So think about that. She was a woman whose life began not in the 20th century, but in the 19th century. She was born in Barbados. Her mother, let me speak her mother's name. Her mother was an Afro-Barbadian woman called Amanda Brathwaite. You don't get more Barbadian than the name Brathwaite, right, Mrs. Toppin? And her father was Manuel de Freitas, a man of Portuguese descent who had been born in St. Vincent, spent some years in Barbados, and then ended up in Guyana. And as we have heard from both the previous speakers, Manuel and Iris's mother never married, and therefore she was illegitimate in the legal and social thinking of the time. She left Barbados with her mother, and by 1910, Joanne tells us, Iris and her mother were living in Guyana, British Guyana. Now, I agree completely with Sir Kenneth. I was very struck. Manuel de Freitas must have been a remarkable man. He was a very successful businessman, and Joanne gives us some info about his business activities. What is remarkable is that although he had legitimate children, he also had several outside children. Iris was not his only outside child. And Manuel recognized all of them, supported all of them, encouraged all of them in seeking higher education, the daughters as well as the sons. And I want to emphasize that that was, in my opinion, quite remarkable. We are dealing with the very early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s. It is clear that Iris's remarkable academic journey in the UK must have been financed by Manuel, because I don't think there was any other way she could have paid for her education. So I think Manuel de Freitas, a very successful businessman, a member of what was then Guyana's very important Portuguese community, played a huge role in Iris's life. I was particularly astonished by the story of Iris's academic trajectory. She spent 10 years in Britain accumulating degrees. I have to say that. Think of the lawyer today, Chief Justice, who is 3 years at UWI and 2 years at Hugh Wooding or Norman Manley. So 5 years. Well, of course, some of you go on to do postgraduate qualifications, but 5 years is what it takes to become a fully fledged attorney at law. Iris spent 10 years between the end of 1918 and January 1929. She went to what was then the University College of Wales at Aberystwyth, and there she got the BA and LLB degrees, 2 degrees. You would think she would have been okay with that, but instead she went to Oxford, one of the great prestigious seats of learning in the UK. And at Oxford, she earned another 2 degrees, another BA. Not sure if I understand why she felt she had to do that, but she did. BA, and then the peculiarly Oxford degree, BCL, Bachelor of Civil Law. 4 degrees from Aberystwyth and Oxford. And of course, she had to study, go to classes, eat her dinners, pass examinations of the Inner Temple in order to be called to the bar. Because of course, this is decades before the University of the West Indies existed. So the only way you could become a barrister was to enter one of the 4 Inns of Court in London. So 10 years, she ends up with 4 degrees and the bar examinations. And she is called to the English bar in January 1929. Now, Joanne notes that as a visibly mixed race person, and the delightful picture on the cover of, well, you can't see it really. The delightful picture on the cover of the book shows that she was a strikingly good-looking young woman, visibly mixed race. Sir Kenneth did not name Elsa Guevara, but I feel sure you were partly referring to her when you spoke about eminent Guyanese women. And as I read the book, I thought a lot about Elsa Guevara, who taught both of us, and of course made a huge impression on us, as she made an impression on every living human being who passed through her classes. I think they came from a similar ethnic background, that is a Portuguese African mixture. And Elsa Guevara was very good looking, and Iris also was a very good looking woman. Anyway, I'm digressing. As Joanne notes, as a visibly mixed race young woman from the colonies, so she had 3 strikes against her. She wasn't white, she wasn't a man, and she came from a colony, an obscure colony. Sorry, Chief Justice, a relatively obscure colony in the context of the whole British Empire. She must have encountered discrimination in Wales and England. If she did, from what one gathers about her personality, she probably shrugged her shoulders and just went on. On the other hand, this period, the 1920s, was a period where barriers to female achievement in Britain were falling. In the wake of the critical legislation, which came just at the end of World War I, which gave most British women the vote and struck down sex discrimination in various fields. That was the legislation that opened the legal profession and other professions to women in Britain. So on the one hand, she must have encountered racial prejudice and discrimination. On the other, she was in Britain when things were opening up for educated women in Britain. Joanne points out that Iris was almost certainly the only woman of African heritage to take the bar examinations in the late 1920s. Joanne tells us that 84 persons were called to the bar with her, January 1929. Only 4 were women, and she was most definitely the only non-white woman. So we can be sure, there's no question, she was the first woman from the Caribbean colonies to be called to the English bar, and very likely the first woman of African descent to be called to the bar. So with her collection of degrees and her call, she came back to the Caribbean in 1929, and as the Chief Justice told us, she was first called to the bar in her native Barbados. So Barbados has a right to claim her as well as Guyana. And the newspapers were very excited when she was called to the bar, and there were headlines in the Barbadian newspapers like First West Indian Lady Barrister. She then came home to British Guyana and was called to the bar there and began her practice in November 1929. She soon established herself as a barrister in private practice, and Joanne tells us in 1932, so that's only a couple of years after she returned and began work in Guyana. In 1932, she was a successful defense lawyer in a sensational murder trial. She got her man off, as they say, and this was made much of in the colony's press and in the region's press, establishing her position as a successful private lawyer. As the Chief Justice told us, she also held several posts in the colonial legal service. Now, despite her successes, or maybe because of all those degrees, the fact that she was in fact much better qualified academically than her male peers, she did face prejudice from some of her male colleagues and some of the subordinates, lawyers who were subordinate to her in the legal service. And when she married her fellow barrister, Iris de Brazao, in 1937, the issue came up, should she be allowed to continue to hold service posts, public service posts as a married woman? It is hard for us to get our minds around this, but until the early 1960s, it was unusual for a woman to be permitted to continue to work in the public service after marriage. It wasn't unknown, but it was unusual. The expectation was that a woman resigned from a public service post on marriage. This was following the position in Britain. As usual, there was a time lag, and in the colonies, it continued a bit longer than in Britain. So the question arose when she got married in 1937. And in one of the striking scenes in Joanne's book, there was even a debate in Guyana's legislature, which I need hardly tell you was an all-male legislature, in December 1940, in which a member, I've forgotten his name, in which a member called on Iris to resign from her public service post because, he said, there were many qualified men who would have been glad of her post. And I think that sums up the thinking and indeed the practice of the time. To his credit, Guyana's then Attorney General, who was a British colonial civil servant, so let's give him credit for that, he defended her and obviously was not going to even contemplate requiring her to resign from her post. And he also said, and the Chief Justice touched on this, he also said she had a perfect right to retain her maiden name professionally. Another trailblazing thing that Iris did years and years before it became in any way common. Now, this book is primarily a biography, but it is very much what we call a life and times biography. In other words, there's a huge amount on the background, the milieu in which Iris worked. So when you read the book, you're going to learn a great deal about Guyana in the 20th century, well, let's say between 1930 and the end of the century, the years when Iris was alive and active, and also into the 21st century. You're going to learn a lot about Guyana's legal history, a lot about the history of legal education in Guyana. Of course, there was none in Iris's time, but that has changed dramatically. So you will learn a great deal about Guyana particularly. But as I said, it is first and foremost the story, to use Sir Kenneth's phrase, the story of a Caribbean woman who dared to enter an ancient profession, traditionally a male preserve, and she faced down difficulties and prejudice to carve out her career. She had a long life. She died, well, relatively recently in 1989 at the age of 92. And she has deservedly received posthumous recognition. The University of Aberystwyth, as it now is, has named an extensive facility in its main library, the Iris de Freitas Room. It was opened just before the pandemic. And of course, the Caribbean Court of Justice, Academy of Law, has recognized her as one of 34 pioneering Caribbean women jurists. Now, thanks to Joanne, we can read her full story. I think this book, which by the way is very readable, I should say, it is an academic book, as Sir Kenneth says, has all the footnotes and references you would expect and an extensive bibliography, but it is a very readable book. I think it's an important contribution to Caribbean women's history. It's an important contribution to the field of legal history. There is growing interest over the last few years in the legal history of those countries which were previously part of the British Empire, which of course all inherited or had imposed on them, however you want to put it, a system of jurisprudence, which is primarily derived, derived from England. So legal history within the Commonwealth, the former members of the British Empire, is a growing subfield, but much of the research, as I understand it, has been concentrated on Africa and Asia. but Joanne's book is an important contribution from the Caribbean on the field of legal history. Of course, it's a major contribution to Guyanese history, since even if Barbados has a claim on her, she worked for her long life in Guyana. So like my previous speakers, I want to congratulate Joanne on the research effort, the dedication for researching and writing this impressive book in a relatively short space of time. And I'll just conclude by saying that I think this book deserves a very wide readership. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Brereton, for those very enlightening words. Must endorse the fact that Iris de Freitas was a true product of the Caribbean. I want to go on with great anticipation and pleasure to introduce the author of this very important and informative book, Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves. Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves holds a PhD in history from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, which she attained in 2014. She is also the managing director. She is currently the managing director of Historical Research International, Inc., and a research fellow and Canadian representative of the Farquharson Institute of Public Affairs. Apologies if I have mispronounced that. She's also the author of the following books. The one that we are launching, Iris de Freitas Brazao, Legal Luminary and Trailblazer. There's also The Portuguese in Business in Guyana, 1835 to 1935, A History of Entrepreneurship, Expansion and Diversification, which is forthcoming in 2024. And From Ashes to Ferroconcrete, A History of the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, Guyana, 1914 to 2014, which was published in 2014. Dr. Collins-Gonsalves is a historian with more than 20 years experience in historical research, projects, and publications. She has authored over 30 research projects, books, book chapters, academic articles, research papers, conference papers, and biographical profiles. She's also served as a contributing author with the Oxford University Press for the Dictionary of Caribbean Afro-Latin American Biography, which was edited by Professor Franklin Knight and Professor Henry Gates, and she has previously served with the CARICOM Secretariat. She currently serves as on the advisory board of the Journal of the Royal Nova Scotia Historical Society and the Education Committee of the Heritage Trust of Nova Scotia. She's a member of the Rotary Club of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and the Canadian Business History Association, the Black Canadian Studies Association, and the Association of Caribbean Historians, among others. In addition to that, Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves is the past president of the History Society in Guyana, a former president of the Rotaract Club in Georgetown, and a former vice president of the Guyana Heritage Society. She is the recipient of the Commonwealth Trust of Guyana Poetry Award, awarded the Rotaract President of the Year for the Caribbean in District 7 to 30, and the Council of the University of Guyana Prize, among other awards. A truly accomplished writer and author. It gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Joanne Collins-Gonsalves to address us.
Thank you so very much, Judith, and I'm very honored to be here with this distinguished panel with Professor Kenneth Hall, Professor Bridget Brereton, the Honourable Roxane George. It is especially gratifying to celebrate Iris de Freitas Brazao today, for she received very little recognition during her life. The late Madam Justice Desiree Bernard, who recently passed, stated in 1989 that Iris passed without fanfare, and I quote, without fanfare and relatively unknown by the vast majority of the members of the profession. Today, we have redeemed her. We have celebrated her contributions and many unknown firsts. During my research on Iris, there are two periods that I found particularly interesting, and all the panelists have highlighted this as well. Firstly, we had this aspect of her intertwined studies and the nature of her academic studies, and secondly, her employment after university. When I was researching Iris, I found out that she was doing research, she was studying consecutively at the Oxford University, at Aberystwyth, And at the same time, she was at the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple, and I was completely mind blown. How did she do this? For the intertwined studies I wrote, and I quote, the 1920s for Iris was an academic season of study and scholarship across continents and in the midst of systemic racism and sexism, as well as the aftermath of the First World War and the onset of the 1918 to 1920 influenza pandemic. She emerged, as we heard, at the end of 1920s with 5 impressive qualifications and became the first woman barrister of law in the Commonwealth Caribbean. Even more remarkable was Iris completed the majority of these studies, as I said, consecutively and at times intertwined. She received her BA from Aberystwyth University in 1922, continued law, and which you can in 1922 to 1923. Simultaneously, in September 1922, she was admitted to and commenced studies at the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple. At the University of Oxford, Iris completed a BA that we heard, a BCL in 1926. In 1927, she completed her LLB at Aberystwyth. Amazing. For Inner Temple, she also passed her bar exams by 1926. And then she, of course, completed it in 1929. The fortitude, strength that it took for her to persevere while completing her studies consecutively and intertwined is phenomenal. In relation to her work, what I find particularly striking is the opposition Iris faced as a qualified barrister at law. Iris, despite her academic qualification from stellar institutions, was subjected to severe scrutiny. As Professor Brereton noted, there were calls for her to resign and her post as clerk of the Attorney General. It was not simply an internal discussion within the civil service of British Guyana, but it was examined nationally. In 1940, in the legislative motion, C.B. Jacobs, a man, of course, was advocating for less qualified men to be appointed in Iris's stead. Iris, with her academic qualifications and 10 years of tertiary and legal training, was infinitely more qualified and perhaps, I would state, overqualified for the post of clerk of the Attorney General. She would have been a sterling asset to that office. C.B. Jacobs noted, and I quote, he said, "In this colony, there are a good many lawyers, qualified men who would be very glad to obtain a position in the government service." Gratifyingly, while Iris faced opposition, she was also supported, as we saw, within the legislative during debates by the then Attorney General of British Guyana. In defending Iris on retaining her maiden name, he noted, and I quote, I'll do the entire quote because this is amazing, that he was defending her in 1940 at that point in time. "She has a perfect right to her maiden name," she says. "Her university diplomas are in her name. She was called to the bar in that name, and she appears in the law list in that name. Her various other qualifications appear in her maiden name, and it would mean a considerable expenditure of time and trouble to have been altered. She doubtless thinks it's not worthy the trouble, especially as she is legally justified in retaining her maiden name for her professional purpose." End of quote. It was absolutely remarkable that she received this sort of support at that point in time. In England, beginning in 1924, female barristers of law like Helena Normington had maintained their maiden names. Additionally, it is important to acknowledge that the support from the foremost legal officer in the colony of that time was indeed instrumental in Iris's case. Despite this opposition, Iris continued to serve. Her historic appointments and roles from the 1930s onwards include the first female Crown prosecutor, the only woman to be a signatory to the registration of the British Guyana Workers' League, the first woman in Guyana to prosecute a murder trial in 1932, which was 16 years before Helen Normington led the prosecution of the first murder trial by the woman barrister of law in England in 1948. This is absolutely amazing. She was also the only female member of the British Guyana Franchise Commission in the 1930s. And she was also the first female member of the British Guyana Public Service Commission in the 1950s. All of this information, we did not know this before. We knew about her tenure at Aberystwyth University and a little bit of information after that. So when I was researching this information and I found all of these firsts and all of her contributions, I was absolutely amazed. In honoring her in 1989, then Attorney General Keith Messiah stated that her many firsts, and I quote, were sufficient itself to win her enduring fame, and it did. The words of Justice Desiree Bernard from 1989, I'll quote her again, are most fitting. She remarked that Iris had good reason to be proud of the progress that women had made in the legal profession. Women are now prosecutors, magistrates, and judges, positions which women in the early years of this century would never have dreamt of holding. The contemporary period is now therefore now considered the golden age of women in law in Guyana. Iris de Freitas Brazao, in all likelihood, would have been very, very proud. As we come to the end of today's online book launch, I would like to sincerely thank everyone for gracing us with your presence. As I noted before, and I would like to restate it, thank you to the distinguished and learned panelists, His Excellent Professor Sir Kenneth Hall, Professor Bridget Brereton, the Honourable Madam Justice George, and Mrs. Judith Toppin. Your insightful and thoughtful presentations truly demonstrate the impact of Iris's academic journey and legal career. Very briefly, uncovering Iris's life was a tremendous journey, one which I could not have done alone. I express my sincere appreciation to the University of Oxford, the Archives of the Honourable Society of the Inner Temple, the UK National Archives, University of Toronto, the Trinity College of the University of Toronto, in which I was able to find the first photo of her in 1918. Absolutely amazing. We have the Aberystwyth University, of course, the Walter Rodney National Archives of Guyana, the University of Guyana Library, and the Barbados Department of Archives. I started this research many years ago, and then I continued it during the pandemic. The archivists and librarians have been phenomenal in helping me get this research done, and I could not do this without them. There are several members of Iris's family that I was able to contact with and have been very helpful. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there's Father Mark de Silva, who is a distant cousin of her, and he's also the author of the Portuguese in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Dr. Robin Croft and Philip White of England, Charles Brazao of the United States, and Mrs. Diane de Freitas of Guyana, Madeira, in England. Mrs. de Freitas was extremely helpful in getting this research. When I visited Madeira in 2010, 2011, when I was doing research for my PhD, she also was very helpful and was able to give me photos and mention to her, because she was also a very good friend of Iris de Freitas Brazao. In fact, after her husband died and after Iris's husband died, and she spent some time with my grandmother, she also spent some time with Diane de Freitas' family. They were very, very welcoming and loving to her. There's also Joseph Jardim of Guyana, who I was able to speak with. I would also like to thank my father, my late father. He was the one, Aubrey Collins, that first told me of Aunt Iris. He's very, very knowledgeable in Guyanese history and constitutional matters and so on. And I said, well, Daddy, what Portuguese person should I know about? And he said, do you know about Iris de Freitas Brazao, Aunt Iris? I never heard about her. And he shared all of this information about her studies and all of that. And I must say, everything that he told me, I was able to double check and was correct information. So I thank my father, who I love and miss very much. I also want to thank my mother, Joanne Collins, for discussing and helping me with this research, as well as my siblings and my cousins Susan and Judith, who were able to find bits of information for me, which I would not have been able to find on my own. I, of course, would like to thank my husband, Seraphim, and my beloved children, Matthew and Teresa, who I have been doing this research with continuously. Iris's legacy has been recorded and accomplishments verified. And I promise to continue my research and writing and publishing. And I'd like to give a special thank you to Professor Brereton, who encouraged me to continue this research. I would not have brought this research to fruition without her encouragement. And it was not only It was just not simply encouragement, but she read the entire manuscript over and she gave her thoughts to me. Any omission or shortcomings, of course, my own. But thank you, Professor Brereton. I'm greatly indebted to you for your assistance in getting this book off. I'd like to particularly thank as well Professor Sir Kenneth Hall. Sir Kenneth Hall has been a mentor to me for many, many years. He has critiqued my work. He has been a supporter of my work, and I am especially thankful. And also by his example, he has written many, many, many books. I also want to thank especially again Justice George, who without question accepted to write the foreword. And for that, I thank you very much.
Thank you again, John. You have continued to distinguish yourself, and we are looking forward to the next set of books.
Thank you so much, Sir Hall, Professor Hall. Yes, I will continue to research and write. And I have, as I told Professor Brereton, I have so many manuscripts to complete, and I promise to get those done.
Thank you, everybody. It's been an extremely interesting session, and congratulations again, Joanne, and see you again soon, I hope.
Very much too. And heartiest congratulations again, Joanne.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming today. I know there are a lot of attendees and persons from all over the world, and I greatly appreciate you. I greatly appreciate all the persons who also have been messaging me from all across the world about this book. And I'm very pleased that we know a lot more about Iris de Freitas Brazao. So thank you very, very much. Judith, thank you for so expertly moderating today's launch. My co-host and the critical support of my sister, Andrea Collins-Fitzpatrick, thank you very, very much.
I think that we have been privy to a most fascinating and inspiring insight into the life of Iris de Freitas Brazao. And I really want to take this opportunity as we conclude to recognize the exemplary scholarly research that you have undertaken. You really left no research stone unturned, and you've investigated every aspect of Iris de Freitas' life. Professor Hall mentioned the detailed footnotes and bibliography. I too was quite impressed at the scholarly research that you undertook, and I congratulate you for your approach. I think you have instilled, I hope that you have instilled in us as Caribbean people the importance of delving into our biographical information on some of our persons now past who have made a significant contribution that we know nothing about. I think that it should inspire us to look a little further in that area, and maybe even our educational institutions should take this on board and see how best we can move forward with this. In addition to the thanks, to thank and acknowledge what I am terming the technical crew of persons who have worked behind the scenes to ensure that this afternoon's proceedings took place seamlessly. Thank you all for a job well done. And thank you for a most informative, illuminating, and inspiring book launch. I thank you.